What if I told you that every single time you roll down your car window for a police officer, you're stepping into a space more psychologically calibrated than most actual interrogation rooms? It sounds extreme, I know, but former officers have openly admitted it. Drivers accidentally confess to crimes every single day, and they never even see it coming. They don't realize they've done anything wrong until it's far too late, and by then, the words are already on the dash cam, locked into evidence. Have you ever walked away from a traffic stop replaying what you said, wondering why you volunteered that detail? That uneasy feeling is not an accident. It's design. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the hidden psychological tactics that turn a routine stop into a confession booth. You'll hear what retired law enforcement officers have revealed about the casual questions that do the most damage, the specific moment a friendly chat transforms into self-incrimination, and the one common phrase that has tricked thousands of drivers into admitting guilt before they even know what they're being accused of. And I want you to stick around until the very end, because there's a legal loophole that most people don't know exists. A loophole that makes almost everything you say on the side of the road admissible, even if no one ever read you your rights. Let's open that loop right now. Imagine it's a Tuesday night. You're driving home, a little tired, maybe a little distracted. In your rearview mirror, red and blue lights flash. Your stomach tightens. You pull over. The officer walks up, calm, almost friendly, and says something that sounds completely harmless. In that moment, your brain is flooded with adrenaline, and your instinct is to be cooperative, to explain yourself, to prove you're a good person. That instinct, as natural as it feels, is exactly what former officers say they relied on. And this is where we need to address something that almost nobody talks about. The traffic stop is not a conversation. It's an information collection event. Everything you say is being cataloged, whether you realize it or not. The officer isn't just making small talk, they're building a narrative, and they're letting you write it for them. Now, let me introduce the first major revelation, and it's one that retired officers have described as the quiet engine of accidental confessions. The moment an officer approaches your window, they are operating inside what's called the pre-Miranda window. You've probably heard the famous words, "You have the right to remain silent." But here's what changes everything. Those rights only apply during custodial interrogation. A roadside stop is legally classified as a temporary detention, not a custodial arrest. That means the officer can ask you almost anything, and they are under no obligation to remind you that you can stay silent. In fact, they're trained not to. Former patrol officers have admitted in interviews and training seminars that they deliberately ask open-ended questions before any arrest is made, specifically because your answers in that window are almost always admissible in court. One retired officer put it bluntly, "I never needed a confession room. The driver's seat did the work for me." That's a disturbing thought, isn't it? But here's where it gets strange. The most powerful tool in this pre-Miranda window is not intimidation. It's not a bright light in your face. It's friendliness. Officers are taught that a calm, chatty demeanor lowers your defenses far more effectively than aggression ever could. When you're scared, you expect hostility. When you get kindness instead, your brain experiences relief, and that relief makes you overshare. A veteran officer from the Midwest who now trains corporate security teams described it this way. "If I walked up aggressive, drivers would shut down. If I walked up like a neighbor checking if they were okay, they'd tell me everything." And then something unexpected happened. He started noticing that innocent people were the ones most likely to talk themselves into trouble because they had nothing to hide. Guilty people, on the other hand, often knew exactly when to keep their mouths shut. This paradox sits at the heart of accidental confessions. The very people who want to prove their innocence are often the ones who say the words that make them look guilty. So, what are the specific phrases that act as traps? Let's walk through a few, and as I do, I want you to notice how ordinary they sound. The first one is almost cinematic. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" It feels like a simple question, but former officers are clear. This is not a question designed to inform you. It's a question designed to get you to admit you committed a violation. When you answer, even tentatively, "Maybe I was speeding a little," or "Was I swerving?" you've just given the officer a voluntary admission. That admission is now part of the record, and it completely changes the trajectory of the stop. Instead of the officer having to prove you did something, you've just stated, on audio, that you believe you might have. In legal terms, That's a party admission, and it's gold in court. But wait, because the second trap is even more subtle, and it's the one that shocks people when they learn about it. It's the casual travel question. Where are you coming from tonight? Or, where are you headed? These seem like innocent icebreakers. Almost nobody talks about this part, but officers are trained to use these questions to establish timeline, location, and potential inconsistencies. If you say you're coming from a friend's house, they might later ask for the friend's name. If you hesitate, that hesitation becomes a cue. If you say you're heading home, but your direction of travel doesn't align, that's another data point. And here's the open loop I promised earlier. There's a 5-word variation of this question that has led to more drug busts and DUI arrests than any aggressive interrogation technique. I'll reveal that exact phrase in just a moment, because you need to understand the psychological groundwork first. The mind of a driver during a stop is unique. You're not in a neutral environment. You're enclosed, with the officer standing above you, backlit by headlights, controlling the entire sensory field. Psychologists call this an asymmetric power dynamic. Your brain registers it as a threat, even if you've done nothing wrong. This triggers the amygdala, releasing cortisol and narrowing your cognitive bandwidth. You can't think as clearly. In this state, you're far more likely to fill awkward silences with nervous chatter. And officers know this. A retired California Highway Patrol officer admitted, "The silence was my best weapon. I'd ask a question, they'd answer, and then I'd just wait. Within seconds, they'd add something extra. That extra sentence was often the most incriminating thing they said all night." That extra sentence is what officers call a spontaneous utterance, and it's a legal category that makes the statement extremely powerful in court. Spontaneous utterances are considered more reliable because they're blurted out without time to fabricate. So when a driver nervously adds, "I only had 2 drinks, I swear," even though no one asked, that is a spontaneous admission of alcohol consumption, and it justifies further investigation like field sobriety tests. It's a micro-confession, given freely, and it happens because of the psychological pressure cooked into the stop itself. Now, let's close the loop on that 5-word question. I want you to really internalize this, because it's the kind of thing you've probably heard in dashcam footage and never thought twice about. The question is simply, anything I should know about? On its surface, it sounds like the officer is giving you a chance to disclose something, maybe a weapon or a medical condition. But former narcotics officers have described this as a psychological tripwire. When you answer, "No, nothing," and then the officer later finds something, that denial becomes evidence of concealment or lying. If you answer, "Well, there's a pocket knife in the glove box," you've just consented, verbally, to the officer exploring that space. And here's where it gets dark. Many drivers, desperate to appear cooperative, will volunteer information about things the officer had no legal basis to search for otherwise. They'll say, "There's an old beer can in the back," thinking they're being honest, not realizing they've just created reasonable suspicion for a DUI investigation. This changes everything about how we understand cooperation. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever said, "I only had 1 drink," when you were stone cold sober, just because you wanted to explain why your eyes looked tired or why you fumbled with your registration? If you have, you're not alone. That impulse to explain, to smooth things over, is precisely what the system counts on. And it's not illegal. It's not a trick in the sense of breaking rules. It's a deeply understood feature of human psychology, woven into law enforcement training. A former officer from Texas said in a widely shared interview, "We weren't breaking the law. We were using conversation the way a detective uses an interrogation room, just without the Miranda warning, because we didn't have to give it yet." This brings us to a major twist, one that shifts the perspective from individual psychology to the broader legal reality. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about the right to remain silent. Most people believe they only have that right after an arrest. That is dangerously wrong. You have the right to remain silent at all times during a police encounter. But if you are not in custody, the police don't have to tell you that. And anything you voluntarily say is admissible. The Supreme Court has affirmed this repeatedly. In the landmark case Salinas versus Texas, the court ruled that a person must explicitly invoke their right to silence. Simply staying quiet can sometimes be used against you if you later testify. This means the legal system places the burden on you, the driver, heart pounding, caught off guard, to know how to navigate a conversation that is professionally designed to extract information. It might feel unfair, and many former officers, now retired and speaking from a place of reflection, agree that the system can feel predatory. One former officer from the UK, who spent 20 years on patrol in Manchester, shared that the training there, while culturally different, mirrored the same psychological core. He said, "We were taught to be human lie detectors, but we were also taught that everyone has a reason to be nervous. We use that nervousness to our advantage. It was only after I left that I realized how easily an innocent person could be mistaken for a liar just because they were scared." That's a heavy statement, and it underscores a truth that doesn't get enough airtime. Our bodies and voices under stress can mimic the signals of deception, and officers are trained to interpret those signals as probable cause. So what does an accidental confession actually sound like? Let me paint a scenario that plays out thousands of times a year. An officer pulls over a vehicle for a broken taillight. The driver rolls down the window and the officer says, "Evening, license and registration please, where are you off to?" The driver, a young professional, says, "Just heading home from a work dinner." The officer, smelling a faint trace of something, maybe cologne or mouthwash, tilts his head. "A work dinner? Long night?" The driver, wanting to seem relatable, says, "Yeah, you know how it is, had a glass of wine with the boss. Just one though." Bingo. That one sentence, "had a glass of wine," changes the scope of the stop. The officer now has reasonable suspicion to ask the driver to step out, to conduct a field sobriety test, to turn a broken taillight into a DUI investigation. The driver confessed not to being drunk, but to consuming alcohol, which is all the officer needs to escalate. And it was all completely avoidable. At this point, you might be wondering, how is any of this legal? And the answer lies in the doctrine of consent and voluntariness. The courts view these roadside conversations as voluntary because the driver is not physically restrained or formally arrested. The officer didn't coerce the driver to speak. The psychological pressure doesn't count as legal coercion. This is the loophole I referenced earlier, and it's a shock to many people when they hear it. As long as the officer doesn't ask questions that are the functional equivalent of interrogation after an arrest, the absence of a Miranda warning does not invalidate the statements. What that means practically is that the most dangerous time for a driver is not after the cuffs are on. It's in the first 3 minutes, when the encounter still feels casual. But here's something I need to make very clear, and it's a point of legal education that's often missing. This video is not about teaching anyone to deceive law enforcement. It's about understanding how the system works so that you can make informed decisions. There is a profound difference between exercising your rights and obstructing justice. You can be polite, respectful, and still protect yourself from accidental self-incrimination. The Supreme Court has said that remaining silent cannot be used as evidence of guilt, though you must affirmatively invoke that right. What many former officers recommend now, from their new perspective outside the force, is learning a script that protects you without escalating tension. Something as simple as, "Officer, I'm happy to provide my documents, but I'm choosing to remain silent about where I'm coming from." That sentence is not rude. It's not obstruction. It's a legal assertion of a constitutional right, and it immediately shifts the dynamic. Now, I want to bring in a psychological concept that explains why so few people actually do this. It's called the obedience reflex. From childhood, we're conditioned to answer authority figures. When a person with a badge asks a question, the social pressure to respond is immense. Not answering feels like defiance, and defiance feels dangerous. Former officers admit they relied heavily on this reflex. One retired sergeant put it this way: "The uniform does half the work. People want to please you. They want to show you they're good. I could ask anything and they'd answer, because saying, 'I don't want to answer that,' feels like admitting you have something to hide." That's the tragic irony. Asserting your rights can feel incriminating, even though it's the most innocent thing you can do. Let's move to another layer that adds even more complexity. It's not just what you say. Former officers have revealed that your body language, your eye movements, even the way you hand over your license, all feed into a running assessment that can trigger further questioning. If your hands are shaking, that could be nerves, or it could be intoxication. If you can't find your registration quickly, is it because you're disorganized or because you're impaired? The officer doesn't know, and the default training is to assume potential danger or impairment until proven otherwise. This is not a criticism of officers, they have a difficult job, but it reveals a system where the burden of proof can subtly invert. Your attempt to prove your innocence becomes the very thing used to justify a deeper investigation. And then something unexpected happened in several states over the last few years. Body cameras and dash cams became widespread, and the public started seeing these interactions from the officer's perspective. What emerged was a pattern. Drivers who said almost nothing, who were calm and quiet, tended to have shorter stops and fewer escalations. Drivers who talked a lot, even politely, sometimes talked themselves into handcuffs. This isn't anecdotal, it's visible across thousands of hours of footage. The data suggests that silence is not just a right, it's a protective mechanism. But the system doesn't advertise that, because verbal information is so valuable to law enforcement. Now, I want to open another small loop, something that's been hinted at but not fully explored. Why do some drivers confess to things they didn't even do? False confessions are usually associated with high-pressure interrogation rooms, but a milder version happens on the roadside too. It's called compliance confession. A driver, overwhelmed and wanting the stop to end, might agree with an officer's suggestion just to placate them. "You were going a little fast, weren't you?" The driver nods, says, "I guess I was." Later, in court, that "I guess" is treated as an admission of guilt. The psychological research on this is clear. Under stress, humans are highly suggestible. We'll agree with authority figures even when we're not sure because conflict feels riskier than compliance. Former officers who now train in de-escalation have admitted that this phenomenon is under-recognized in police training, and that many officers mistake compliance for genuine guilt. At this point, you might be feeling a mix of frustration and curiosity, and I want to channel that into a question I'd love you to answer in the comments. If you were ever stopped and asked a seemingly casual question that you later realized was a trap, what was it? Your stories might illuminate this issue more than any expert can. And if you haven't had that experience, consider this. What would you do differently now? Before we move toward the final revelations, I need to touch on a critical legal distinction that often gets overlooked. In both the US and the UK, a traffic stop can evolve from a consensual encounter to a detention to an arrest. At each stage, the legal protections change. But here's the catch. The driver rarely knows exactly which stage they're in. The officer's tone might stay friendly, but the legal classification has already shifted. This ambiguity is not an accident. As one former officer explained, "We're taught to keep it conversational even after we've made the decision to arrest, because a relaxed suspect gives better information than a hostile one." So the friendliness you experience might continue right up to the moment the cuffs come out. That's a chilling thought, but it's true. Now, I want to circle back to the idea that this is not about making anyone afraid of police. The vast majority of officers are doing a difficult job with integrity, but the system itself contains incentives and structures that reward information gathering above all else. When budgets are tied to ticket revenue or arrest stats, there's a quiet pressure to turn every stop into a potential case. And that pressure filters down into training, into the questions that are modeled for recruits, into the casual phrases that have become standard across entire departments. That's why former officers can admit these truths now, because they're no longer inside the system that demands those results. Here's a final pattern interrupt that might change how you see all of this. The person who designed some of the most widely taught roadside interview techniques was not a police officer, but a social psychologist studying persuasion. The Reid technique, famous for interrogations, has a roadside cousin that adapts behavioral analysis to the traffic stop. It teaches officers to look for clusters of behaviors, to ask benign questions that slowly circle a topic, and to use narrative building to get suspects to place themselves at key locations. This is all done without any formal custody. The driver never hears the words, "You have the right to remain silent," but everything they say is being used to construct a story that will be presented in court. That's the reality. So, let's start bringing this together. The open loops. We've revealed the 5-word question, the pre-Miranda window, the accidental admission of alcohol use, the body language trap, and the compliance confession. But there's one more thing you need to understand. Why this matters beyond the traffic stop itself. Every time an accidental confession happens, it shapes case law, it influences plea bargains, and it sets precedents that affect civil liberties. When you know this, you're not just protecting yourself. You're contributing to a culture that values informed consent and genuine justice. That might sound lofty, but it's incredibly practical. If more people understood these dynamics, the accidental confession would lose its power, and the system would have to rely on evidence, not psychological advantage. I promised at the beginning that we'd explore a loophole that makes roadside statements admissible, and we've now fully unpacked it. The combination of the detention doctrine, the voluntariness standard, and the pre-custody window. It's not a single loophole, it's a legal architecture that has been built over decades, upheld by courts, and taught in academies. The only way to navigate it is with knowledge. As we near the end, I want to leave you with a reflection. Imagine a world where every driver knew 2 sentences. I'm going to remain silent. Am I free to leave? Those 2 sentences, delivered calmly, are a complete game changer. Former officers have said that when a driver invoked their rights clearly and politely, the stop often de-escalated quickly, because the officer knew the driver was legally literate and the fishing expedition was over. That's empowerment, not confrontation. So here's my final question for you, and I genuinely want you to sit with it. If the safest thing an innocent person can do is stay silent, what does that tell us about the nature of these encounters? It tells us that being innocent isn't always enough. You have to be informed, you have to be intentional, and you have to understand that your words, as harmless as they seem, can be reshaped into a confession you never meant to make. Thank you for watching this deep dive. If you've ever experienced something like this, or if you're a legal professional with insights, the comment section is open. Let's keep this conversation going, because the first step to changing a system is understanding exactly how it works. And now you do.